Turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. See if I can get the slides to work. Very good. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Now the time came after God had dispossessed himself of the nations, after the failures of the Tower of Babel and man's continual rejection of the Lord. The time came where God said, I will work my salvation through a people of my own choosing, through a people that I have made. So he said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. You see here in Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abram, and he says, we will ride or die together. I've got your back, no matter what. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Abram was 72 years old when he set out from Haran. And he took his barren wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions that they had accumulated and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through that land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, to your offspring I will give this land. So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Abram continued in the land. But then a famine arose, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was so severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Church, there can be little doubt that when God called Abram and made his promises, Abram believed, but only until the going got tough. Church, there can be little doubt that what Abram tells his wife here is an abandonment of the role that God had intended, not just for Abram, but for all husbands. Church, there should be little doubt in our mind that this was a great failure on behalf of Abram. I'm going to leave that there. We'll come back to it. Let's look at 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we've been moving through this scripture, and Paul has just made this argument about the power and the wisdom of God. And he has said, in verse 22, Jews demand signs, Greek look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. We preach Christ on a cross. And this is a stumbling block to the Greeks who look at that as an electric chair, to the Greeks who look at this cross as a means for the worst criminals to be executed. This is a stumbling block to them. And to the Jews who believe that anyone who is hung on a pole is cursed, this cross, this message of Christ crucified is a great stumbling block. But to those whom God has called, to those who respond to the gospel, both Jews and Greeks, Christ and his crucifixion is not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to be deconstructed, but rather it is the power of God and wisdom of God for the foolishness of God. And understand, church, that for the first century world, that cross is foolishness. But the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. He makes this argument, and then he looks at the Corinthians. He looks at those Christians in Corinth, and he says this. He says, brothers and sisters, think back to what you were when you were called. Really think back to what you were when you first responded to the gospel. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many of noble birth. You see, church, the city of Corinth, even though it was Greek, it was actually Roman. It was in Greece, but Roman, because back in 150 BC, the Romans had completely demolished the city. They had taken its inhabitants and they had sold them off into slavery. When Julius Caesar rebuilt the city and repopulated the city with his own veterans, his own Roman legionnaires, when he did that in 40 BC, around the 40s, there was no one there. And so the Romans rebuilt this city very much in their image. And it was a mercantile city because it was on a peninsula, and there was a narrow path from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. And so it was a major port city. Imagine the city of Corinth. The city of Corinth, the ancient city of Corinth, would be this. This is the Corinth that these Christians know. Imagine if you had wrapped up Vegas, New York, and Houston all in one city, and they happened to host the Super Bowl twice a year. That we tracking what this city was? This was a land of opportunity. What do I mean by that? In a city like that, trade matters more than anything. And if you can make it in trade, we don't care where you came from. We don't care if you're an escaped slave. We don't care if you came from a priestly family. We don't care what your background is. If you're willing to hustle, you can make something of yourself in Corinth. And so nowhere else in the ancient Roman world was society more blended. Corinth looked a whole lot like our nation today. That's the fact. And these people engaged much like our people today in our nation, engaged in selfish self-promotion, rampant self-promotion. And what happens when you practice rampant self-promotion? What do all the kids want to be today? How many kids want to grow up and be doctors today? How many kids grow up and want to be lawyers today? But every kid who has access to the internet wants to grow up and be an influencer today. But to be an influencer, you have to have a lot of self-promotion. And so much of what they dealt with, we deal with. And there was great arrogance in this church because it was all about me. Burger King has launched one of the most, probably one of the most successful and influential ad campaigns by simply saying what? What's Burger King's slogan? Have it your way. Man, does that not speak to us? I get it, and I get it my way. I love that. And that's what the Corinthian church was dealing with. That's what every single one of them was dealing with. So when you have that level of pride, that level of arrogance, that level of self-centeredness, that rampant individualism, when you have that, you forget. This is the first thing we do. When we're successful, what's the first thing we do? Forget about the failures. We let it go. We don't want to think back on that. We don't want to think about those things. No. That's who I was, not who I am. And how easy is it to fall into that thinking in the church? Think of what it means to have answered the call of the gospel. What do you have to accept to answer the call of the gospel? Well, don't you have to accept that you're a criminal? Don't you have to accept that you can't save yourself? Don't you have to accept that you're broken? And no matter how hard you try, and no matter how hard you work, you will never be good enough. It's a hard thing to accept. It's one of the reasons why the gospel call today is so unpopular. Because we ask that people accept that there is a standard and that they have failed to meet it. In fact, this whole idea is so repugnant that now politicians in Europe, if they stand on what the scriptures say, get brought up on hate crime charges. Because to tell people the truth, that you are in fact a failure, that there is in fact a standard that we have not met, that we are all broken. To merely say that, for some people, is just unthinkable. They can't handle it. And so all over the world, all over the Western world today, we see that the gospel call, the message of the gospel itself, that humanity is broken. And in all sorts of ways. Church, I don't care. I don't care what your brokenness may be. I don't care if your brokenness is related to sexual immorality. I don't care if your brokenness is related to any version of that. I don't care if your brokenness is related to murder, to theft, to lying. I don't care. But whatever your brokenness is, you have to accept that it's there. You have to accept that in some way we have fallen. We have failed. We have done the things that we ought not to have done. We have displeased God in the worst ways. Paul himself looks at this congregation and he will say in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he will remind them that some of them were adulterers, some of them were fornicators, some of them were homosexuals, some of them were thieves and liars and murderers. Some of them were those things. But now, look at verse 27. Despite those things that you were, despite the failures, it says in 27, God chose. God chose the foolish things of the world, those who are fundamentally broken. God chose the weak things of the world. He chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. But God chose. God didn't choose the wise or the strong. He did not choose to make his message, the gospel, only obtainable to an elect few. He did not make his gospel only obtainable to those who were strong enough to take it. He made his gospel available to those people who were willing to say, God, I see what you're saying here, and I am broken. God, I see the standard that you have laid before me, and I have failed. You see, God's standards of success is vastly different than our own. God's standards of success could never have been fathomed because God's standard of success is self-sacrifice. God's standard of success is, are you willing to give yourself up for someone else? Because God was willing to give himself up for us. The worst of the worst. Failures in every way. Paul will say in Romans chapter 5 that God's love is known by this, that he died for enemies. He died for enemies. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things of this world and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. Think back to your Old Testament for a second. I'm not going anywhere. I'm done. I'm done walking. We'll see if I can make it through this without walking around. Okay. Think about your Old Testament for a second. We just read out of Genesis chapter 12, Abram. Why would God call such an appalling man? A man that would hide his own life behind his wife. Despicable. Disgusting. Isaac, his son, will do the same thing. Jacob, his son, the word Jacob means supplanter or thief. And he earns that name, doesn't he, church? By stealing his brother's birthright, by cheating everyone around him. And yet God calls Jacob and confers on him the promise. Moses was a great guy, wasn't he, church? A murderer, was he not? Killed an Egyptian and fled. So a murderer and a coward. And yet God calls Moses. Who else does God call? David? A man after God's own heart. And what is he? Is he not an adulterer and a murderer? Man, God's got a great track record of picking them, doesn't he? What did the law teach us? What does the Old Testament teach us? It teaches us, church, I heard this saying not long ago, but it teaches us, church, that God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. God did not choose Abram because he was a great man of faith, but because God intended to make him a great man of faith. God called Moses not because he was a great man, the son of Egypt though he was, educated in the imperial court though he was. God did not call Moses for those things. God called Moses because he was going to make him into something. God called David not because David was great. He calls him when he's the youngest son and a shepherd. He calls him because he's going to make David great. It's the same with all of the people that God called. Think back to who you were when God called you, church. Did God call you and lavish salvation on you because you were a raging and wild success? If you are, I want to talk to you. If that's who you were when God called you, I want to talk to you. Because I know where I was when God called me. I remember 8 years ago exactly where I was. Destroying my family, destroying my career, on the last legs of hope. Sitting in my house every day, scrolling through my phone, looking for a divorce attorney because I thought the problem was my wife and not me. That's where I was, church. If you don't believe me, you please talk to my wife. She will tell you who and what I was before the gospel. I remember it. It's hard to forget because now we're waiting for our 7th child. Please save me. I'm a hostage. Seriously, church, God takes the weak. He takes those who are broken and He fixes them. This is the nature of the gospel. This is what it is. This is why God does what He does. Because the strong aren't really strong. Human strength isn't really strong, church. Human wisdom isn't. You want to know what human wisdom is? In the 70s, marital counselors used to tell people, they used to tell couples, oh, your marriage has gone stale. Well, what you need to do is you need to bring another person into the relationship. That's human wisdom. Oh, your husband really wants to go out and have sex with someone else? You ought to make that happen. That's human wisdom. Human wisdom is you have a need, you have an urge, you should go through and you should get that. Human wisdom today is this. You think you're a boy and you think yourself a girl? Chop yourself up into bits. Then you'll be right as rain. Human wisdom. It's destructive. It's horrible. And God knows that it ends. It ends in terror. And so God looks at us and He says, no. True power is this. True wisdom is this. I'm going to take those people who are broken. I'm going to take those people that I made. I'm going to take those people who rebelled against me and fought against me, and you watch what I do. I'm going to die for them. And by dying for them, clean them. And by cleaning them, giving them a new heart. I'm going to take out their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. I'm going to take their old spirit and put a new spirit in them. And then I'm going to put my spirit in them. Then they will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. I'm going to nullify the things that are, he says in 28 and then in 29. Why? So that no one may boast before him. How quick we are to want to promote ourselves, to promote our success, and to compare ourselves to other people. Church, I submit to you today that the only person you should ever compare yourself to is Christ. Because if you compare yourself to me, you will one day arrive because I am a failure. If you compare yourself to me, church, you will surpass me. And then woe is you because you will have thought you arrived. But if you compare yourself to Christ, church, when will you arrive? Is there not more to grow? Can there ever in this life be a time in which we have said, I have attained? Is this not what the Apostle Paul tells the church at Philippi when he says, I forget what lies behind and I press on towards the goal? Because he knows as long as there is breath in this body, we have room to grow. Because the destination is Christ. He says in verse 29, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him. It is because of him. It is because of God that you are in Christ Jesus. Some have taken this to mean that that means that God chose from the beginning of time who is saved and who is damned. That's not what this means. What this means is without God, the offer of salvation isn't even on the table. That unless God chose to lay it down, that unless God chose to bring a perfect sacrifice, the Hebrew writer will say, and if you're in Dan's class, you're going to get to this point, but the Hebrew writer will say that the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. The only thing that could take away sin is the blood of Christ. And this was his plan from the beginning. The perfect image of God, the perfect Son of God, the Lamb of God, butchered on that cross, bled on that cross, died on that cross. And it's because of that that the way is now open. Jesus told them, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but through me. He offers himself on that cross to open the way. The question that we must face, church, is, are we willing to admit that we need him? Are we willing to admit that we're broken? Are we willing to admit that we're failures? Are we willing to remember where we were before he called us? Because when I do, when I remember that it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord, when I remember that my only boast could be in him, I don't look at my brothers and sisters and hate them. I don't look at my brothers and sisters and shame them. I don't look at my brothers and sisters and say they're nothing but a bunch of hypocrites. I don't need to be there. Have you ever heard someone say that? Church is filled with nothing but hypocrites. I don't need to be there. The arrogance. The arrogance to utter such foolishness. To think that you have somehow arrived. Therefore it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. When I remember who I was when God called me, when I hold that stark in my mind, when my brother Jim, I'm going to pick on you, brother. I'm not going to walk over there. I don't want the thunder to come back. But when I deal with Jim and he drives me up a wall, when I deal with Brother Dan and he drives me up a wall, when I deal with Brother Jeff and Brother JG and Brother John, when I deal with my sister Sue, and when you all have to suffer through me, remembering where we came from is the key to all of it. Because I want to deal with my brothers and sisters in charity. I want to love the people that my God has called. I want to serve them. But if I think I'm better than them, I never will. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. I boast in the Lord because he has called me. I boast in the Lord because he redeemed me and he has saved me. I boast in the Lord because of him, I am who I am today. My hope, church, is that you remember who you were. That it has not been so long that you have forgotten where you were when God called you. And you may be out there this morning and you may be thinking, well, brother, I grew up in the church. I grew up in it. And I don't have that story. I don't have that. I can't remember a time where the grace of God did not surround me. Don't think that you're cheated. Not for 1 second. Because I need brothers and sisters like you who can look at my life and who can look at those like me who come into the church later. They can look at our lives and say, oh my gosh, that's horrible. That is wrong. That is not the way it ought to be, brother. That is not right. The things that happened in your life are wrong. There's a better way. We need brothers and sisters who can honestly say that and who can honestly speak to the wonders of God put into practice. So if you've forgotten who you were, or you think that your personal testimony and what God has done in your life doesn't matter, I want to encourage you this morning. It does. We are a body church, and we desperately need one another. I pray that we all remember what it is that God has done for us, that we all hold on to those things, and we remember that God has not only worked in our lives, but in our brothers and sisters' lives as well. This morning, if you're here and you don't know where you stand with Christ, but you're ready to admit that you're broken, you're ready to admit that you need Him, you're ready to admit that the power of the gospel has the ability to change you. If you're here this morning and you're in need of prayer, we have elders standing up in the back. If you're here this morning, whatever you need, I ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.